And this afternoon, again, we have a very favorite old-timer with us to act as moderator. She's been with us for many years now. She is one of the most ardent, outspoken, intelligent, and verbal defenders of the nationalist Chinese, and she has done a tremendous job for them over the years. We recognize her as an outstanding authority in that field. She was a Wellesley College graduate, and she has done a great deal of research on Asiatic problems. So it is with pleasure that I present to you as our moderator this afternoon, Dr. Margarite Atterbury, who is better known to most of us as Daisy Atterbury.
Thank you, Colonel Bunker. Mrs. McKinney, fellow Crusaders, did you ever see a dream walking? Well, here's a dream, somebody having a dream. Do you know, when I get back to New York, I'm going to say I had the most wonderful dream at the rally. I dreamt I was on the same dais with the Honorable John G. Schmitz, and I was introducing John G. Schmitz. Nobody ever heard of me. They've had nothing but John G. Schmitz ever since he ran for president and everything else. But it was introducing him. Don't you think that was a wonderful dream? If I could only dream that way every night. Well, I always thought it was just enough to be in the audience and hear Mr. Schmitz, his wonderful clear-headed presentation of our problems and his analysis of them. But to be here and perhaps to be a little liaison between what I think and what he thinks, it's simply out of this world for me. Well, I want to tell you why I was simply bowled over by Colonel Schmitz. Because of his uncanny intuition about the Far East. Now, this is as rare as hen's teeth, I want to tell you, for anybody to have real intuition about the importance of the Far East. And yet here was a newsletter, August 1971, in which he spoke about the human cost of communism in China. And then on the reverse side of this newsletter was about America's retreat from her anti-communist stand. And I want to tell you, I said, if we only had a few hundred people like that in Congress, we'd have a very, very different kind of a country from what we have now. I just want to say a word or two about the importance of free China to us and our future. It's because I have dual citizenship. I am a citizen of China, I am a citizen of America, that I realize we have a spiritual axis with our great sister republic, which took over the Gettysburg Address as their guiding principle. This government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I can't tell you how earnestly, just as our forefathers prayed at Valley Forge, the leaders of free China have prayed for guidance and support from our Heavenly Father, our Savior, in helping to build a great, great country. And in spite of the apocryphal history that's being promulgated by the Ivy League colleges, still we have the majority of authentic scholars on our side who support this documentation. Unfortunately, people don't read them. Now, there's St. John's University that's getting out a whole series of very fine research books on the Far East. Dr. Paul K.T. Hsieh, who is the director of the Asian Studies at St. John's University, has written China's Strenuous Decade. And this is a symposium of articles by people such as J. Lossing Buck on agriculture, the late Dr. Ballantine on China's international relationships, and other authorities on education, economics, all the wonderful factors of that strenuous decade from 27 to 37, when China was booming ahead and was on her way to becoming one of the great, strong, free countries of the world. I was privileged to be a participant observer of that period, and I'll never forget the glory as we looked forward to a wonderful future, just as our forebears did in the early days of our own republic. The communists had been defeated and driven out of China in 1934, and oh, the bliss of getting rid of that bunch of gangsters. They were the bad guys. They attacked the missionary installations, they attacked the schools, they buried people alive, they came in and terrorized the population. If you heard Mao Zedong was coming, you didn't open your arms and welcome him with flowers. You ran for your life. That was what the communists meant to China, and that long march that they try to glamorize after a bunch of Robin Hoods, it was like marauding African ants sweeping across the country. They killed or kidnapped 20,000 helpless peasants in Jiangxi and forced the ones that were alive to go along carrying their luggage, leaving village after village with no men. But as soon as they were up in Yan'an and could be penned in there, oh, the relief of getting rid of the communists. And that was why Japan struck in 1937, because China was getting ahead of her, and the whole Japanese army came in Ford cars with American gasoline. That was a time of utter horror. Our little villages, we had 32 little villages. I was like a mother hen. They were all my little chickies. And to see that horrible army sweep across, leaving dead bodies among the cornfields, that was a time of absolute heartbreak. And yet who in America ever thought or ever cared? They all said, well, we've got to have free trade. My, if we don't make money, somebody else will. The fact that they were selling to murderers and being participant in this aggression seemed to mean nothing to the American public. And yet we got it all back at Pearl Harbor, and our poor boys paid the price. Well, that is the sort of thing that Mr. Schmitz is sensitive to and understands, where other people are absolutely oblivious. And that is why he's such a rare prophet as well as a statesman. You know the slogan from Milwaukee, if you're out of Schlitz, you're out of beer. You can say also, if you're out of Schmitz, you're out of gear. And I wish to say that's what's wrong with our administration. It's out of Schmitz. And it's their own fault, because they had a Schmitz and then they got rid of Schmitz in a very dastardly manner. And I guess they're pretty sorry now, and they'd better repent and do better next time. Mr. Schmitz has a very fine roster of achievement. He's a member of the Chinese Science, the Chinese Scholars Association on Taiwan, which is very hard for a foreigner to achieve. He was active in the Marine Corps. He's now a lieutenant colonel of the reserves. And it would take too long to list his honors, but the very latest ones were, he was elected Man of the Year in 1972 by the Americans of German extraction. He was elected He was elected Congressman of the Year by the National Economic Council last May. He was elected Statesman of the Year by the Freedom Foundation in October 1972. Man of the Year, Congressman of the Year, Statesman of the Year. What are we waiting for? Why is this man out of a job? I want to tell you that Mr. Schmitz is very usefully employed as Professor Schmitz at the Santa Ana University teaching political science. I just wish we had him at Columbia University, but he wouldn't feel at home there, I'm afraid. And he gets out a fascinating newsletter with some very timely articles. He also writes a great deal of very pertinent material for American opinion. And you would do well to keep in touch with Mr. Schmitz and his interpretation of the present scene if you want to know what it's all about. Well, I don't want to take any more time that could be utilized by Mr. Schmitz. And so I will say again, here is our candidate. What are we waiting for?
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor, for that nice introduction. And speaking of politics, I might point out, to take a turnabout of the old baseball saying, you can't lose them all. Well, you're going to hear from Phyllis Schlafly tomorrow about the Equal Rights Amendment. But I want to tell you about a political victory that the Schmitz family had recently. The oldest Catholic school in the country, at least so it claims, is Georgetown Preparatory School, founded by the cousin of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, John Carroll. And for those of you who are familiar with church problems and the Jesuits, you know my old saying about the Jesuits, there's nothing wrong with them that a good Inquisition wouldn't cure right now. But Georgetown Prep, being the oldest Catholic school in the country and being a Jesuit school, I thought many of you Americanists here would be pleased to find out that the recently elected president of the student body is my son and Bircher, Joe Schmitz. So you see, Schmitz did get elected president after all this year. Well, before getting into the meat of what I have to say here, I'd like to relay a cartoon to you and then give you a commercial. By the way, thank you for a commercial for my newsletter. There are some sample copies at the Captive Nations booth out here. But there was an interesting cartoon in the New Yorker, of all things, that American Opinion might want to buy up or borrow for one of their issues. And I was reminded of it before I came up to the stand here because some of the journalists were asking me about my views on Watergate. And of course, this is a big question that all the journalists are interested in. It reminded me of this cartoon, which I thought was just great, and I have to pass it on to you because I'm sure that New Yorker is not one of the favorite publications being read by this group here. But it seems there was someone laying on a psychiatrist's couch, obviously with mental problems, and he's talking to the psychiatrist, and he says, according to the caption, "Doctor, that case of political paranoia that you cured me of, what do I do now that it turns out I was right?" I'm sure as we view the present news that thought has struck many of you, that just as as they almost had you convinced that, and almost hoping that you were wrong, it turns out you're right. And, well, at any rate, I'd like to give one more commercial here. I jokingly have told people, and maybe it'll turn into something serious, that I'd like to compete with some of these booths out here and put out a 12-inch record, maybe, and sell some of the things that ought to be sold, some of the ideas that ought to be sold in a maybe easier manner, because a lot of people don't like reading, and a 12-inch record sometimes is very effective. For example, there is one side that could be devoted to a substitute for the politician. Instead of the politician, you could have a one-act play. Now, for those who have read The Politician, I ask you to visualize to see if this is not a palatable way of getting across the same point. And I'm just going to give you previews of coming attractions here. But it's a meeting in the Waldorf Astoria on December 7th, 1941, of the insiders. And they're meeting there, and they're pacing the floor, and they have mixed expressions on their faces. And one says, "We've done it. We've got them to bite, and we're at war now, and we can now, the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor. We can now send our troops to to Europe to save the noble socialist experiment over there. But we've got a problem. Artie, tell them the problem." And Arthur Schlesinger gets up, and he says, "Fellas, as a historian, I have to tell you a problem here. You see, after every war, now that we're in war, which is all right with us, but I'd like to warn you about something, that after every war, the people turn to their military leader for civilian leadership, and their faces turn white as they all gasp at once, 'You mean MacArthur?' And he says, 'Yes, it's a problem.' And they say, 'Well, what can we do about it?' And one of them puts up his hand And he says, Jack Ruby, we're not ready for your types yet. And then they go on to say, well, what about, can't we build up Marshall and make him even more important than MacArthur? And I said, impossible. And anyway, we've got Marshall slated for something else. We've got something, a Marshall plan, and you'll hear about it later. And they go on and they tick off the generals. They say, what about Patton? He's a colorful fellow. We can build him up. Not a chance. Much too patriotic to work for us. And so they go on down the line, and they go down the generals and the colonels, and they're aghast. And what can we do? What can we do? And finally, and this could be the title of this side, finally, one of them looks at one of the members sitting there and says, Milton, don't you have a brother in the service? No. And then it could be, everything after that could be anticlimactic, you know. I mean, my brother Dwight, why, he was a major in World War I, he's still a major. My gosh, you know, he can't even read a speech. And, well, it's all right. We can build him up, and we can even make him president of Columbia University after the war to give him a little polish, you know. How's that? Okay. Well, now, you know, you don't have to prove that this went on. It might just make a saleable point. Now, that's one side. Now, the other side is more of current events. This is for those people who aren't as devoted to the conspiracy view of history, but know something's wrong, and this might be an explanation. And my apologies to Bob Newhart. This is a telephone conversation, one of these one-act plays, which is the one they're waiting for is that outstretched hand here. But we'll, as I commented last year, you have to be very careful with a German name and a mustache, how you gesture in front of some of these press people here. Yes, sir. Well, anyway, it is not true that when I ran for office, I campaigned on annexing the Sudetenland. It is not true. You do remember my campaign. It sounds refreshing now, doesn't it? Remember, never go to war unless you plan on winning. Those who work ought to live better than those who won't. And at home and abroad, we ought to treat our friends better than we treat our enemies. Not bad. Well, anyway, now with apologies to Bob Newhart, the phone call, and the phone rings in the Oval Chamber on the hotline, and the president answers. He says, hello, Alexei. You don't sound as friendly as you usually do. You say, check? What do you mean, check? Like in Czechoslovakia? No, like in chess? Checkmate? Or what are you talking about? You mean all that technology we've been sending you for 50 years now, you've been doing what with it? Well, sure, I know what you can build in truck factories, and the computerized technology, you've been doing it to make more efficient the what? And you've got them aimed where? And well, now wait, Alexei, don't do anything drastic. Let me send Henry over there to talk to you, and don't do anything. Pull no triggers. Till you hear from Henry, will go over and talk to you. So. Scene 2, the phone rings, and it's Henry this time. Says, Henry, what do they want? They want me to grovel? Go to Peking with my hat in hand? Oh, Henry, my speeches, you know. You think you can sell that to the American people as if it's something good, that they always wanted it? Henry, if you can do that, you're a genius. Scene 3. Phone rings again. Henry, you're a genius. Henry, I don't know how you did it, but it's great. The only one who complained was my own congressman, and we zapped him real quick. Well, that's just the first thing. Now, what else? They want, oh, Henry, they want a third of all our grain. Henry, how are we going to sell that to the American people, Henry? You can sell it to them as if, oh, Henry, that's great. As if it's something good. A third of their grain, ship it over there, and you'll sell it to them as if it's something good. Henry, that's true. They did go for the China trip. Well, Henry, there are some problems, though. You know, how do we send it to them? Like, what are they? We just send it to them, and you say we sell it to them. And that's funny, Henry. What do they pay us? We give them the money, and Henry, that's kind of funny. We give them. Henry, we did that once. Remember during World War II? They still owe us $11 billion, and the law says that we can't lend anyone any money that hasn't paid their World War II Come on now, Henry. Yeah, we cancel off the 11 billion for a half a billion. Henry, that's funny, Henry. You think the American people would go for that one, canceling an $11 billion debt for a half a... Yeah, they did go for the China trip. That's right. Okay. There's also a problem with the Export-Import Bank bill, Henry. You know, we can't lend money to countries that are furnishing supplies to people that we're fighting with. You can get that change. And you think Congress... Yeah, like Congress went for the China trip, too. That's true. Okay, Henry, you've got a couple good points there, that if they went for the China trip, they'll go for anything. But we got one problem here, Henry. 1/3 of our grain goes over to them. You know, grain makes feed, and cows and pigs and chicken eat feed, and drive the price of meat sky high, Henry. And how are we going to get around that one? Oh, Henry, that's the last straw. I've been with you till now, but blaming it on the butchers is too much. Well... Well, okay, enough for the commercials and previews of coming attractions, but I would like to get into the topic at hand here today, which is war. And, you know, Sun Tzu Wu, the ancient writer on Chinese warfare, to keep in the theme of the afternoon here, in fact, Mao Zedong likes to quote from Sun Tzu Wu, especially the following quote: that supreme excellence in warfare is not in winning all your battles, but supreme excellence in warfare is in having the enemy surrender before going to battle. Now, if you think about it, that's very true. Many people miss a very important point. They think warfare is simply a matter of throwing hardware at each other, and that is not it. In fact, Dr. Fred Schwartz once said that if the communists will have won World War III, it will be because they knew they were in it. And many people lose wars because they don't know when they're in a war. It doesn't take two to make a fight. If one doesn't want to fight or doesn't know he's in a fight, he just loses sooner. That's all. And this is the problem that many people do not realize, either that we are at war or the nature of the war we are in. There are many facets we could talk about here, but the facet I'd like to talk about this afternoon is the big picture. Sometimes we lose sight of the big picture. We are so involved in fighting over the means to the end that we sometimes wonder what the end is. Now, let me leave that thread hanging for a while, and I'll weave all these threads together. And let me just ask you a question. How many people in here, you don't have to answer or even put up your hands, but how many of you are not anti-communist? Well, in this group, practically everyone, other than the communist spies among you. And if you'd ask the average American, and one TV poll indicated this, the average American is anti-communist. In fact, one recent poll showed 83% of the Americans are still opposed to communists, for example, holding government jobs, which is quite encouraging, except for one thing, that if you ask the average American to define communism, he couldn't even imagine it. And how many of you here, if you were asked to define communism, how many of you could do so? The problem here is that almost everyone's in opposition to communism, and yet they are opposed to a word, communism. They know it's bad. Of course, the young people coming up in our schools don't even know that, because if their professors are for it, it can't be all bad. And right now it's more hazardous on a college campus to be an anti-communist than a communist, of course. But the point is that to the average American, if communism came under a different guise or under a different name, they might swallow it completely. For example, I used to read to my students in teaching philosophy. I'd read to them the Humanist Manifesto, which was promulgated in 1933 by a group known as the Humanists in this country. I would read the Humanist Manifesto, but I'd leave out the words humanism or humanist wherever they appeared in the manifesto. And after it was all over, I'd ask my students who put out that manifesto, and invariably they say it was they would say it was obviously communist. Not only that it was communist, but it was obviously communist. Now that's very interesting, since it would be very easy to make a case nowadays that secular humanism is the established religion in this country. And that's a speech in itself, but for those of you who have pursued current events in the educational and philosophic field in the country and in the world today would have to agree with that secular humanism is, for all practical purposes, contrary to the First Amendment, the established religion in this country. Okay, now what is secular humanism? I propose in the next 15 minutes to show you how the basic tenets of secular humanism and the basic tenets of Marxism are far closer and are, in effect, ideological blood brothers, and they are far closer in philosophy than the differences between either of them and the traditions that built this civilization in this country. Tying this in with the Sun Tzu Wu's admonition that supreme excellence in warfare is not in winning all your battles, but supreme excellence in warfare is in having the enemy surrender before going to battle, you have to pose this possibility: is it not possible, and not only possible but probable, that we have already surrendered before going to battle by surrendering by default to the secular humanists and allowing them to set up virtually the same goals as the communists have set up in that system that we are now raising billions of dollars to defend against, so that all we're really arguing in official circles right now is the method by which we bring about these basically similar goals. And if the only thing we're arguing about are the methods by which we attain basically similar goals, it will be very easy to convince the American people in a very short time that methodological differences are no longer worth fighting for, and that we can get together under this great blue umbrella of the United Nations. And why should we fight over simply the way in which we attain these similar or same goals? And we will be able to get together in the United Nations and live happily ever after, and I say it very sarcastically or ironically, under this one world socialist government. And where will we have lost? We will have lost when we surrendered before going to battle by not fighting on the home front, not fighting those who had basically the same goals and only differed in methodology with that system that we were allegedly in opposition to. Now, let me elaborate on that theme. Back when I was working for my master's degree at that fountainhead of philosophic thought on the West Coast, Long Beach State College, I wrote my master's thesis on the subject, The Controversy Over Collectivist Influence in Social Studies Textbooks, which in the late 50s and 1960 was not regarded as birchy, but simply a little strange as a topic. And in writing this thesis, I came across, research-wise, an interesting group who operated in the late 20s, known as the Frontier Thinkers. For those of you in the field of education, some of the names might ring a bell. Theodore Bromell, George S. Counts, Harold Rugg, the famous Rugg social science series that was quite controversial in the 1930s. They even had a young man working with them who made a name for himself in a field outside the field of education, Edward R. Murrow. At any rate, this group of frontier thinkers was quite enamored with what they sometimes referred to in terms similar to the noble socialist experiment going on in the Soviet Union. Mind you, this was even prior to our recognition of the Soviet Union. They were so enamored that they began a program of sending school teachers over to the Soviet Union to study these techniques and what was going on in the Soviet Union. Basically, their outlook, if I might paraphrase it, was this: that, and this might sound familiar to some of you, they liked what they were doing, but they didn't like their methods. They liked the goals of the Marxist revolutionaries in the Soviet Union, but they thought they were a bit sloppy, a bit messy, a bit bloody. And so they took what in England became known as the Fabian approach. They took that approach in the United States. They felt that the same basic goals could be carried out in this country through the field of education, and so they got themselves into the fountainheads of educational thought in this country: University of Chicago, Columbia Teachers College, familiar to Dr. Atterbury here. And what they did was they began teaching the teachers of teachers. And there is many a teacher today who is simply parroting from their notes, from the notes of some of these frontier thinkers. Now, let's take a few points one by one and see some of the implications to bring these down to concrete examples. And I'm going to use some fairly big words, and I don't want that to frighten some of you, because I'm going to try to explain them in everyday language and bring them down to concrete examples here. If I were to define communism, I would do it in this manner. Communism is a philosophy that's based on three basic tenets: atheism, dialectical materialism, and economic determinism. Okay, atheism, dialectical materialism, and economic determinism. I believe those are the three basic tenets that Cleon Skousen lists in his fine chapter on the philosophy of Marxism in his book, The Naked Communist. At any rate, we have these three basic tenets, and most of you are familiar with that first one, atheism. Now, what is one of the main basic tenets of that of those rulers of the groves of academe in the United States, if not atheism, at least agnosticism, and the Humanist Manifesto bears that out. The Humanist Manifesto bears out that there cannot be any distinction between the sacred and the secular. Okay, so whether you build a political system on atheism or agnosticism, the result is the same, which is the dethroning of God. Now, our founding fathers did not intend, even when they wrote the First Amendment, that this was to be a godless society. When they said Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion, they meant that one religion shall not be favored over another. Of course, there is an interesting paradox that has developed because of Supreme Court decisions. Supreme Court decisions and an Attorney General's opinion out in California have defined religion in such a broad manner that you don't have to believe in God to be a religion anymore, and secular humanism can and has been, as in the case of California, defined as a religion. In fact, and that's why I say that if secular humanism is a religion, then it should not be the established religion, and it should not be taught in our schools either. We had some California women We had an interesting case in this vein out in California where some of my former constituents from Orange County, California, took this approach all the way up to the State Board of Education, and the State Board of Education ruled in their favor. And so that in California today, evolution is no longer taught, and they were fundamentalists, and therefore they were pursuing it on the grounds that if saying a prayer in school is obnoxious to an atheist, teaching evolution is obnoxious to a fundamentalist. Kind of an interesting point. And that if you can't take an atheist's money for public school purposes and have a prayer, then you can't take a fundamentalist's money and use his money to teach evolution. That was a very interesting point, and without getting into the issue on evolution versus creation, they had a very interesting legal point. If they are going to say that such secular movements as the Ethical Fellowship movement in California, which is a secular humanist organization, can have their officers perform marriages, that they are a religion, that you don't have to believe in God to be a religion, then you should not teach some of the basic tenets of their religion as official doctrine in our schools. And the State Board of Education bought this, so that now you cannot teach evolution, but you can teach about both evolution and creation. And that is the policy in the California schools right now. Kind of an interesting point. But the interesting, and I don't want to lose my major point here, I just say that's an interesting paradox, but our founding fathers did not intend this to be a godless society. I'm sure our founding fathers, if they had gone up in a satellite, that they would have quoted from the Bible too. And they would have told Madeline Murray where to get off. But I don't mean to get off the satellite. But there are some basic problems when you dethrone God, publicly or officially. When you dethrone God, you also dethrone the idea of the divine law or natural law. Traditionally, in our civilization, there had been the assumption, the underlying assumption, that there is a natural law, there is a God, there is a divine law, which is a natural law, and man can't change that. Man cannot change that. The idea, historically, in our civilization has been that civil governments are set up to, as our founding fathers said, secure the rights. Our founding fathers did not set up a government that granted rights. They recognized God-given rights. They might talk about the same rights as in the Soviet Constitution or the United Nations Charter, and many of our teachers point out and list certain rights, and they show the similarity between the Soviet Constitution, the United States Bill of Rights, and the United Nations Charter, but they miss a very important point, and that is that our founding fathers were a continuation of this basic tradition that there are certain laws, objective, outside the individual, to which governments should mold their civil law. Governments can recognize certain of these laws and rights, but they don't give them. And that is the difference between ours and the Soviet Constitution and the United Nations Charter. That we recognize there are God-given rights, we recognize there are God-given laws. But when you dethrone God, you dethrone the idea of God's law, and you automatically enthrone man, and you enthrone man's law. then from that time on, man is God, and man's laws replace God's law, and the law is whatever the temporary rulers of the secular governments then decree. The big problem in Washington right now is not immorality, it's amorality. That's the problem. You see, let me give you two examples, Watergate and abortion. You might say, what's the similarity? Or maybe you might say, what's the difference? But let me give you two examples here. Okay, let's talk about Watergate. After 2 generations of bright young men growing up under John Dewey-type education, wherein they are taught secular humanism, where they are taught a neo-sophism as modern as ancient Athens, where Socrates railed against these people who said there were no absolute values, that the highest thing in life and in education was to teach people to get their way. Check your ancient history. Check Socrates in his day, how he railed against Protagoras, who said, man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. In ancient Athens, today, man is the measure of all things, not God. And so after 2 generations of these bright young men growing up under this John Dewey secular humanist educational system, in which they are taught that there is no God, and that the highest thing in life or in law is the law that is arrived at by man's processes, by a democratic process, why shouldn't they feel when they get into high government positions, when they get appointed to the White House staff, why shouldn't they feel that they are the law? Why shouldn't they feel that way? They get confused, and of course then the pot calls the kettle black. The mass media of communications, which are hardly the repository of the traditions of the absolute divine law, then suddenly find great fault in these people and start resurrecting the idea of an absolute law by which these pragmatists in government are now in violation, when the mass media and the educational system are perhaps the greatest perpetrators of this idea that there is no greater law than that which man comes up with. It's the pot calling the kettle black. Not that the kettle isn't black or the pot isn't black, but it's about time that some of us old-fashioned types who had been old-fashioned enough to preserve this idea of the natural law ought to step forward. Not to say I told you so. You know, some of my friends I think would like to lose just so they could sit in a dungeon and say to their neighbors, I told you so. But to now proudly bring forth and analyze and point out where did we go wrong. And that's where we went wrong. Now, if I might just take a little time out from the main theme that I'm developing here, namely that when you get away from the divine law and set man up as the supreme law, you get such things as Watergate. If I might deviate a little bit, because the press would like to have me say something about Watergate. They don't. Okay. Yeah, he's nodding yes. He's very honest. He's nodding yes. So all this, the problem is we have gotten believe me, the problem really is that we've gotten away, we've dethroned God and enthroned man. But if that's a little too ethereal for the viewers of TV and the readers of newspapers, let's talk about Watergate. Okay. You know, I'd like to just point out how there's kind of an interesting, almost an airtight circumstantial case that I was Watergated in not only 1 but 2 elections in 1 year. So I will pass over briefly a fact that may be arrived at in these investigations if they stop trying to see how high the Watergate operation went and start following Senator Lowell Weiker's comment, and I hope I'm paraphrasing him correctly, when he said that they operated in congressional districts across the country. No one has seemed to want to pursue that. It's not only how high did the Watergate operation go, but how low did it go? How many tentacles went out into different races around the country? I think an interesting one came to light the other day when it looks like there was one tentacle of the operation in the Wallace gubernatorial primary in 1970 down in Alabama. And I think most of you are familiar with that. Okay, there's one. Another one came to light a while back when it was shown that, when a congressman suddenly died of gunshot wounds out in the eastern shore of Maryland, Congressman Bill Mills, and it came to light that it seems that surrounding that case was a $25,000 transfer of funds from the Re-elect the President Committee to the Mills special election in 1970. When the treasurer of the Committee to Re-elect the President appeared on TV and was testifying regarding the dispensing of $25,000 to a congressional campaign, he was asked if he didn't think that was a bit strange to spend money that was collected to re-elect the president in a congressional race, and he said yes, he did. He thought it was bad precedent for 1972. Now the question I'd like to raise is, was that precedent followed in 1972? Now, let me just bring out some interesting facts. The bagman in the case of that $25,000, according to the testimony of Mr. Sloan on TV, and those of you who watched it might have even seen that big list on the board, in which there was $25,000 transferred to a Mr. Hitt. As it turned out, obviously, the Mr. Hitt was Mr. Robert Hitt, the administrative assistant to Rogers Morton, who went on TV explaining that the reason this wasn't claimed by either the Committee to Re-elect the President or the Mills campaign was because it was a loan. All right, that's all right. But let's pursue this. The Mr. Hitt was Mr. Robert Hitt, obviously, who just happens to be the husband of Patricia Hitt, who is Undersecretary of HEW. At a public speech at which I attended, my opponent, I mean the congressional opponent that I had during my congressional primary, made a public statement that he was flown to Washington, or asked to fly to Washington, by the Undersecretary of HEW, Pat Hitt, wherein she convinced him that he should run for president, or for Congress against me. Now, it's very strange for a Republican presidential appointee to call someone to Washington to ask a seated Republican incumbent, or to ask someone to run against a seated Republican incumbent, especially the president's own congressman. Very strange. It's especially interesting when her husband, previous to that, had transferred $25,000 from the Committee to Re-elect the President to a different congressional campaign. Now, common sense tells me that the conversation might have gone something like this. And he says, "You want me to run against Schmitz? That takes bread, baby." And how many of you... And how many of you think that she would have said, "That's your problem," in view of the fact that her husband had already transferred $25,000 from the Committee to Re-elect the President to a congressional campaign? Well, let's look at some other coincidences. Other than the fact that the PR firm which handled my opponent's campaign filed a $31,000 loan to the campaign, and the man who operated the campaign, A. Chip Cleary, is a former partner with the same Bob Hitt in the firm of Hitt and Cleary. But I might point out also an interesting factor that Pat Hitt went to Washington was appointed Undersecretary of HEW by Robert Finch, whom I have it from good authority was the man who brought the message to Orange County that I was to go. At any rate, Bob Finch brought Pat Hitt to Washington because she had been his Southern California chairman when he ran for lieutenant governor. The seat of Republican activities in Southern California during that campaign and since and before that is Orange County, California. The Orange County chairman during that '68 campaign was none other than Herb Kalmbach, who has been in the news as having the biggest chunk of money to throw around during the campaign. I only ask a lot of questions, and I hope the Watergate people start looking in that direction. It seems to me, with all that $250,000 slopping around by the friends of the people who talked my opponent into running against me, that it would be almost inconceivable if some of that money didn't slop over into the campaign against me, in view of the fact that I spend more money than I've ever spent in any of my campaigns running for re-election and was outspent. Well, that's just the primary. Then going on into the presidential election, and this one has been reported, and I'll have to tell you a funny story about this one. There was a $23,000 reported bribe attempt in the presidential race where the man on the West Coast who was putting out the press releases for my presidential candidacy was approached, at least so he reported to the campaign and the Orange Police. He was approached by three men who took him for a drink and told him that they had investigated him and knew about his financial medical problems. And this is a good one if you got any film left. And they knew of his $23,000 in debts, and they said they were very willing to pay off his debts if at the proper time he would put out a press release of their choice instead of the press releases coming from the campaign. Now, you might ask at that time, and we thought, well, who'd want to spend $23,000 just to get one press release? But now when you find out how much money they had throwing around, as I think it was Porter said, the big problem in the campaign was, in the Republican campaign, was they had too much money. And the one comment that indicates who they might have been was that they said it would have been embarrassing to lose the home district, and at that time polls were showing that my vote in California might have thrown the election in California to George McGovern, which might have been very embarrassing to one of the candidates who lived in California, not me, the other one. Well, at any rate, it's kind of interesting how all facets of the Watergate case get publicity, except these don't seem to get aired very well, but maybe they'll get around to them. On the other hand, it just, sometimes I think if I got good publicity, for example, if it were advertised that I'm the youngest man in American history ever to get over 1 million votes for president, if that had been a liberal, I'd have been on Time magazine. But if Time magazine would have put me on the cover of Time magazine for being the youngest man in president in history to get 1 million votes for president, then I might have felt that we were wrong. So, you see, okay. Well, enough of a digression on Watergate. As I said, the real problem on Watergate, I maintain, and there are many ways of trying to understand what's going on, but certainly it's an aspect of this modern amorality, that there is no law. The law is whatever those in the seat of government say it is. And so when these young men get in the seat of government, they are the law. Let's take abortion. And no matter which side you take on the abortion issue, you have to ask yourself this question: why has abortion become an issue just recently? I'll tell you why. It has become a real controversial issue recently because it's only recently that men have decided that they have replaced the divine law. Now, a lot of you will say, well, wait a while. Now, these, and there may even be some in this room who will say, some of these women's libbers sound like Birchers when they say, no government's going to tell me what to do with my body or my life. It sounds like less government. Well, not quite right. It is an example of what we call in logic the vicious circle, or begging the question. They are assuming that they have already won the argument. And the argument is this, namely, when does life begin? When does life begin? Government's primary function is the protection of life. And there's a variation here of that old saying that my right to swing my arm stops where your nose begins. Her right to do with her life stops where someone else's life begins. The big argument is, when does that other life begin? If she wants to say it starts at birth, then she's already won the argument. But that's really what we're arguing about. And I'll say this, that I've sat through 16 hours of testimony in the California legislature on the abortion issue, and I've seen theologians and doctors arguing about when life begins. When does government's primary function of protecting life begin? But I'll tell you this, you're being just as totalitarian as the Soviets when they took the Lysenko-Lamarck controversy and said, we scientists can't decide who's right, let's let the politicians in the Soviet Presidium decide. And we took the same attitude in California, and so have other states, and so has the whole nation, when they said, we can't decide when life begins, so we're going to let the politicians decide when life begins. Now, I'll tell you this, no true lover of liberty will want to take that position, that government itself should decide when its primary function shall begin. Because any government big enough to state the date when life begins, when their primary function of protecting life begins, is big enough to change the date. And they're doing it right now already. In fact, there have been laws introduced in Florida and Hawaii to start from the other end. And we saw it just a week ago when on the East Coast here, right in this state, if I recall correctly, a doctor was indicted for mercy killing. And what did the newly elected president of the AMA say? Instead of deploring it, he said, well, we've got to set up a committee now to decide just under what circumstances mercy killing is all right. Rather an interesting concept, an interesting departure. But is it not part of the same basic problem, which is that when you dethrone God and you dethrone the divine law and you enthrone man, man makes the law. Any government big enough to set the date when life begins is big enough to change the date. And you're going to get to the same situation that Sparta was in back a couple of thousand years ago, when they decided that life began after birth. And then they could look over and kill the weak ones and just keep the strong ones and do a little good breeding that way. You could do that now in the case of thalidomide babies, couldn't you? Why not let them all be born and have the state decide that life begins 2 days after birth, and you just have to kill the bad ones and you could cut down the mortality rate? Now, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying this is the problem you get into when you let the state have the power to decide such a factor as when life begins. It's a variation of the same basic problem that leads us to Watergate. I'll come up with other examples of that, or maybe I can come up with them right now. If you think that you are God, you can even change the laws of history. You can change the historical laws of economics. You can ignore the fact that never before in the history of economics have price and wage controls controlled prices and wages. They've always led to shortages. As Richard Nixon himself once said, they've led to shortages, black markets, rationing. That is not the road for America, and I will not take the nation down that road. He himself knew. Well, okay, if that's the law of history, why are we going into it now? Why are people accepting it? Well, first of all, the wish is father to the thought. People want to believe, and there are politicians and conspirators who will capitalize on this desire of the people to believe that for some reason history is going to change for themselves because they have dethroned God and now they are setting up the law. We have discovered that we can create the law ourselves. You know, you can decide that we are a democracy, and we can decide to vote out the law of gravity, and to prove our faith in democracy, we can all walk off a 10-story building, and we would suddenly find that you can't change the laws of God. You can't change the laws of history and economics. You can't change the laws of history that never before in history have signing treaties with an enemy, a paper treaty, have they changed an enemy into a friend. John Jay said, I wouldn't give a I wouldn't give a farthing for parchment security. They, referring to these paper treaties, last only as long as either side is ready or willing to tear them up. And John Jay must have been turning over in his grave, spinning in his grave last week when the press and everyone else just said, hurrah, the Cold War is over. We have signed a paper treaty with the people who have disregarded virtually every paper treaty that they have ever signed. And trading with enemies. And trading with enemies have never changed an enemy into anything other than a stronger enemy. And yet, for the first time in history, there are people who believe now that we are setting the law, we are even going to change the laws of the history of trading with enemies. But you see, it's part of this same process of the wish being father to the thought, but this idea that was perhaps best expressed by President Nixon a year ago in his State of the Union message that no one in the press caught. I think I'm the only one that put in printing in my newsletter, when he had all these people, all these politicians, both houses of Congress. He had the Supreme Court, he had all the ambassadors, he had the entire cabinet, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had everyone who was anyone in officialdom in Washington, D.C. in that one room in the House of Representatives chamber, and he wound up his State of the Union message and he said, in this room are the people who are going to solve the problems of this country. And I said, oh God. I said, these people are the problem, not the solution to the problem. But why did no one pick this up? Because we believe that problems can be solved by government playing God. You know, I thought, what of the captains of industry? What about the governors even? What about the mayors? What about farmers and miners and all these people whom we had thought built up our country despite politicians? But there he said, with all the politicians in one room, these are the people. Why? Because this was God out there. We were God. We had replaced God. We had dethroned God. We had dethroned God's law. We were God. We were going to make the law, and therefore we were going to solve problems. We were going to continue creating something out of nothing by raising the national debt and creating money out of nothing. And we were going to continue to change the course of history. We were going to continue to change the law of God because God can do that, and we were now God. Okay, let's go to that second point, dialectical materialism, and look at some facets. Dialectical materialism is not as bad as it sounds. It's as bad as it sounds. It's not as hard to understand as it sounds. Materialism in this case is the idea that is shared by both the Marxists and the humanists. And it is this, that man is matter in motion and nothing more. He has no soul, he has no spiritual side, he has nothing to distinguish him from the other animals. He is a high-grade animal, but qualitatively no different. He is material, he is complex material, but nothing more. Now, if an animal gets sick beyond repair, what do you do to him? Well, if an animal gets hoof and mouth disease, you don't want that to spread. That's a physical illness that might spread to the other animals. You're concerned with the herd, so you get rid of him. You cleanse the herd by getting rid of him. The word purge means to cleanse, and so under the Soviets, they are very open about this. They simply purge. And it is very difficult for our young people to understand the implications of this type of materialism, because they are taught in the main by materialists in this country who are embarrassed by the logic of the Soviet materialism. They are simply embarrassed by the logic, so they try to point out, or they try to cover the fact that these things go on. Have you ever heard of the average typical college instructor teaching about the Hue massacre? But have you heard of any of them not talking about the My Lai massacre? Going on almost simultaneously. They just don't want to admit some of the implications of materialism, because they basically agree with the materialism, but they don't like to admit that if you are a materialist, it's very logical that you come to such conclusions that the Soviets have arrived at in justifying their purges. Have you heard any modern, typical history teacher in teaching the history of World War II talking about the Katyn Forest Massacre? No, because it's very embarrassing. Let's talk about dialectical materialism and the Katyn Forest Massacre. Under the dialectic, this is simply a method by which everything progresses towards the classless society of communism dialectically by a conflict of opposites. And all change leads to the classless society, and all change takes place by the conflict of opposites. And therefore, since they've already done away with the traditional Ten Commandments type of good and evil, the new morality is that which furthers this conflict, which furthers this progress towards the classless society of Marxism, is good, and that which hinders it is bad. And killing off the Polish officer corps that had been captured in the original partition of Poland, and that's what happened. The Soviets captured some of the Polish troops, and after the Polish government in exile formed an alliance with the Soviet Union following the German invasion of the Soviets, these Soviets killed off the Polish officers they had in custody, shall we say. About half of these 7,000 to 8,000 Polish officers were found in several large pits, shot in the back of the head, and bulldozed over. There was an attempt to blame this on the Germans at the Nuremberg trials, but miraculously there were a few survivors, and the evidence began to point to one of the judges at Nuremberg, and so instead of reversing the positions, the case was simply dropped. But you have to ask yourself the question, why would the Soviets kill off 7,000 to 8,000 Polish officers who were technically allies at the time? And the answer is very easy to understand under dialectical materialism, because they were planning on taking over Poland after the war, and what furthered the communist takeover of Poland after the war was good, what hindered it was bad. The Polish officers would be the civilian leaders in the future Poland, post-World War II Poland. They would be the ones most likely to lead the Christian resistance to the communist takeover of Poland, and therefore to purge them was not only not bad, it was actually good. It's quite a simple concept and quite easy to teach to college students, but why is it not taught in our schools? Because the materialists, the secular humanist materialists, are quite embarrassed because they don't really disagree with what is being done. They simply disagree with the methods. And they are quite embarrassed that once you accept as basic philosophy, such things as the Katyn Forest Massacre can be very easily justified. Well, we could use example after example, but let's turn to that third one of economic determinism. Economic determinism simply says that what man is determined by the economic system he lives under. Determinism in philosophy means that man has no free will, that everything he does is mechanically the result of the environment around him. Everything he is determined by the world around him. An economic determinist says everything he is determined by the economic system he lives under. For example, you are all here today because you are living under capitalism or free enterprise, and you have under capitalism or free enterprise, you want to make money. So you are here to make money, or to find a system to preserve. You are all the wealthy people who are trying to preserve the wealth that you have. The economic interpretation of the American Constitution by Charles Beard, before he turned revisionist and had a hard time finding a publisher for his books, but in his early days, Charles Beard was an economic determinist and wrote this book, The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, in which he came to the conclusion, and 2 generations now of American history students have been fed this economic determinism, that our founding fathers were the landed Virginia aristocracy. They were the New England traders. They had and smugglers. They had all the goodies, and they were trying to preserve the goodies that they had. And that's why they set up our Constitution. Many of you who are young enough may remember having been taught that. It's economic determinism, pure and simple. I debated with an economic determinist once who was not a Marxist. He was an American, but he was an American economic determinist. All communists are economic determinists, but not all economic determinists are communists. Some are simply following the mainstream of the American educational system. Now, I was debating with this person. I said, you mean to say that everyone in America is motivated by this desire to make more money? I said, at this time, Dr. Tom Dooley was quite a bit in the news. I said, haven't you heard of Dr. Tom Dooley, who went off to the wilds of jungles of Southeast Asia to build hospitals? He could have been a wealthy doctor here in suburban Southern California. I said, haven't you read his books? And he said, yes, and I've also bought them. And very clever of him. You see, his implication was, yeah, the only reason he does this is to have material to write books so he can sell books and make money. That was his economic determinism. Sure, I've read Dr. Dooley's books. I also bought them. Don't kid me, Jack. Dooley's got some of my cash. That's an economic determinist, that everything man does, he does for the economic system he lives under. But the point is that not the blood brother of what is being taught in our schools and has taken over our legal system and our political system and our fiscal system in financing? Is it not true that every time we have a problem in politics, that we solve the problem not by asking people to change themselves, but by spending more money to change the environment around themselves? You can make an interesting case to show that crime has risen in direct proportion to the money spent in changing the environment, supposedly to change the environment, so that these decisions that they're making could be changed, since their decisions are not their own fault. They are simply determined by the world about themselves. To fight crime, we must get to the cause of crime, right? You know what J. Edgar Hoover once said before he died? Words to this effect: the primary cause of crime is that too many people are deciding to do the wrong thing. Kind of an interesting, old-fashioned idea, isn't it? But to those who control our educational system and our legal system, the primary cause of crime is something outside themselves. You can't solve your problems unless you agree that you've got some problems. And right now, we are being told that our problems are strictly environmental, and I don't mean this ecological. I mean that the problems are due that we haven't spent enough money in our cities, we haven't spent enough money on this project and that project. The great American myth is that any problem can be solved by spending money. That's the great American myth. How about this? How about coming to the conclusion, if you're a true scientist, after a couple of generations of spending money to solve your problems and not solving the problems, if you're a true scientist, how about rejecting the basic hypothesis that man has no free will? In other words, that's the hypothesis they're going under, and that everything he does is determined by the world about himself. How about getting back to the old-fashioned idea that man has a free will? Plain old-fashioned idea. You know, one of the most successful therapy systems is Alcoholics Anonymous. I was told by a member, one of the big boys at the pool hall told me, he was a member, and he said that when he entered Alcoholics Anonymous, he was told that he could blame his drinking on his family, his job, his war wound, but they wouldn't even take him into the program unless he agreed that his basic reason for drinking is his decision to lift it up and toss it down. Now, isn't it interesting that without a lot of government federal aid or state aid, that there's a group that is successful in curing a problem, and they don't have the money. and the groups that have the money to change the environment, to change man, are somehow failing dismally. Well, maybe it was planned that way. Obviously, there are conspirators who will take advantage of this failing in people to believe or to feel that the wish is father to the thought. But the point is that historically, our civilization is based on the idea that there is a God and a God's law. That man has something that distinguishes him from the rest of the animals, and that, as the philosophers said, he is a sui generis, a class by himself, and that he has a free will, and that he is answerable for how he uses that free will, and he's going to stand in judgment and be answerable to it. Okay, those three basic tenets are opposed point by both the Marxists and those who have gained preeminence in our own educational system. They are opposed by atheism and agnosticism, by dialectical materialism and the materialism of the secular humanists, and the economic determinists or the simple determinists of the American system. And you're not going to solve the problems of this country by surrendering before going to battle and surrendering to the enemy and missing this very important point of the battle, that right here in our country, officially, contrary to the First Amendment, we have a system, a religion that is being taught, and we are going around and all too often falling into the trap of arguing about good or bad methods in attaining all too common goals. You're going to fall into it. Now, that's the problem, and I look out there and there are many sad faces. You say, oh, that's right. Oh, look how bad we are. What do we do about it? And maybe, out in Southern California, we've gone through that stage, and maybe you've gone, there are various stages that conservatives go through. And one of the stages is, how much time do you think we've got yet? Does that ring a bell? That other areas too? They've got it. You don't have to wait for a time. That any time you want to start getting out from under it, you can. You don't have to wait for anything. You go through all this, and without any, I hope this is taken in the spirit it's intended. We go through and we meet each other in the streets. You all set? Got your Sam Andy? And yep. I've got my Sam Andy. I'm not kidding. I got it. Or any of the other competitors. I want to be fair here. Got your Sam Andy? Got your silver bullion? Yeah, I got it. Got your silver coins? Yep. Got your reloader? Yeah. What you building the swimming pool for? That's to soak the Sam Andy in. When I ran for president in 4 counties, I was runner-up to Richard Nixon, and McGovern ran behind me. You know which 4 counties they were? The counties backing up to the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone Park. All my Southern California constituents who grabbed the guns and the groceries and headed for the hills ended up, and that's why I lost in Southern California, but when I ran for president, there they were to vote for me, up there in the hills, and they came out of the hills to vote, and, okay. Well, I'm making a point here that we all go through these stages, and you want to run from it, Back in the late 50s, I told my wife, I was teaching this course on anti-communism in the Marine Corps, and I said to my wife, Mary, I said, all is lost. I said, I've been teaching communism, and there's no hope. I said, there's only one hope, that we can man the lifeboats and save ourselves and find some out-of-the-way place, off the beaten track, civilized but peaceful, that the conspiracy could care less about. And Mary, I said, grab the 4 kids. We only had 4 at that time. People thought we were Protestants. I said, Mary, grab the 4 kids. I've got a peaceful spot picked out. We're moving to Ireland. Good head work. That's good head work. Good head work. I've got to tell that story I told last year here at this time about Ireland. A little girl bouncing her ball down the streets in a city in Ireland, singing a little ditty, rather inflammatory. The Protestants own all the houses. The Protestants own all the houses. Bounced the ball past a priest, and he said, no, little girl, can't you sing something a little less inflammatory, something we have in common with our Christian brethren? We're trying to solve our problems, not chafe them. And so she came up with something that pleased him temporarily and started to sing, Christ was born in a stable, Christ was born in a stable. A smile came across his face until she rounded the corner, and he heard her singing, Christ was born in a stable, Christ was born in a stable, because the Protestants own all the houses. Okay, now a solution to the problem. You know, you're looking for the plan, right? The plan. What's the plan? Okay, Colonel, Congressman, John, Senator, whatever. You've described the problem. Now, what's the plan? You know, my former running mate Tom Anderson has a favorite cartoon of two people hanging in there's two people hanging in a dungeon by their hands and their feet, and there's a little opening on the top, and that's all iron barred over, and they're hanging there. No way of getting out, and one says to the other, now listen closely, here's my plan. Now, I'm sure there are many of you who kind of feel that way, maybe even after the picture I painted. Okay, here we are. Now, what's the plan? How do we get out of it? Okay, first of all, keep your eye on the ball. You know, many an error has been created by throwing to first before the ball's in the mitt, right? There's also an error by arguing who's got the nicest stateroom when the ship's going on the rocks. And the ship can go on the rocks, and who's got the nicest stateroom isn't going to make any difference. The first thing is let's keep our eye on the ball as to what the stakes are, who the enemy is, what they're after, what they're trying to enslave us, and then hang tough. Hang tough on principles. Don't confuse means and ends. And there's a difference between, like money is a means to an end. If you regard money as an end in itself, you become a miser. Keep in mind, don't confuse means to ends, but hang tough and be charitable. You know, sometimes we become very charitable. We have to project. Isn't it true that sometimes there's not really a generation gap, there's an education gap. We're learning all these things. We read American Opinion and review the news and all the truth. I don't mean to say that just because I'm a council member of the Birch Society. There are a lot of other good publications out here for sale too. But anyway, you know, by the way, speaking of being a council member of the Birch Society, I still have newspapers that when they list me, they say, you know, John Schmitz, a member of the Birch Society. That's kind of like calling a cardinal a priest. You know, I wish they'd give me credit at least for being on the council. You know, I tell you, anyway, the point is that we get this educational gap. We kept reading more and more about the conspiracy. The conspiracy takes a bigger part. We become more and more knowledgeable, and our neighbors become stupider and stupider. And you want to grab them by the stacking swivel and say, you idiots, don't you know that we're going down the tubes? And what do? You get in your camper and go out to the desert every weekend, when what you should be doing is you should be going to Birch meetings with me, and you're laughing very hard. Does that ring a bell? Oh, that's your idiot neighbor who you brought here to hear this speech, and I'm embarrassing you. Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, the point I'm making is that keep your Christian charity. You know, judge not lest thou be judged. A lot of these people are big people. Sometimes the conspiracy gets so large that it's like the old saying, you know, everyone's on the other side except me and thee, and sometimes I wonder about thee. The conspiracy gets bigger and bigger, and the true believers get smaller and smaller, and we purify our movement to sterility. What we've got to do is keep our Christian charity pushed to the utmost. Some of these neighbors are good Americans. They just don't want to believe it. No, they just don't want to believe it. Sometimes we push them too hard. I may have psychologically pushed some of my constituents too hard by making them make this choice that either their congressman was wrong or their president was wrong, and it was just psychologically unbearable for them to feel that their president would be wrong, and so they had an example of kill the messenger. You know, it's much better to have the congressman be wrong. You know, I use a good example, and I've used it over and over again, about the big problem is that there's a murderer, thief, rapist crawling in the window, and you're asleep, not necessarily you, but your neighbors, and you might use this on your neighbors. That you've got a couple of problems when there's a dog barking in the backyard against this intruder. And your immediate problem of your few problems is discomfort at being awakened from your sleep. Now, you can solve that immediate problem by convincing yourself that your dog is an incurable case of acid indigestion and going out and shooting him. And then you can go back to sleep and you've solved your immediate problem. Now, there's too much of dog shooting going on, And sometimes we have to be very careful, and sometimes our neighbors and your neighbors will turn against you, and it's just a variation. They'd rather shoot you than, I don't mean actually shoot you, but they'd rather find some reason for not listening to you than to listen to you. So you've got to be very careful, and you've got to have some idea of human psychology. And the old saying about you can't feed a steak to a baby, well, it's true. It'll regurgitate. And so you've got to be very careful about feeding your neighbors and feed them a little slowly. And by the way, forgive some people if they don't feed steak to a baby too. You know, like every time I give a speech, tell them about this and tell them about that, and give them the true conspiracy, you know, and all that type of business. And please, folks, there are a lot of people who are good Americans who don't want that ship to go on the rocks. And I would just keep your lines out to them, but be a beacon. And that's one of the points I want to make. Be a beacon to them that when we're hitting a period of crisis, they're thrashing around for an answer. If you kept good relations with your neighbors and they suddenly find out that something's wrong, they're going to come to you. When I speak to college students, I come to them and I say, I'm not trying to convince you in the next hour that I'm correct. I can't undo your professors. I say this in colleges other than my own. I've got a pretty good chunk of their time when they're my students. But when I go to other schools and I give an hour lecture, you know, I'm called in as the House Conservative to prove how broad-minded they are. And I say, I'm not trying to convince you that I'm right. I've only got an hour here. But what I want to do is, to borrow a phrase from one of my opponents, make myself perfectly clear. Because I don't have to prove that I'm right, because I am convinced that time is going to prove me right. But what I want to do... What I want to do is make myself perfectly clear so that when time proves me right, you'll remember where you heard it first, and you'll then come back to me, and together we may still save the situation if you really want it saved. Now that's something to keep in mind, that we're in an excellent opportunity now. No matter how you analyze current events, no matter how you analyze them, and I still can't figure out all the facets of this Watergate situation, but there's no doubt that we're in a period of crisis. There's just no doubt at all. Now, there are people thrashing around, they say something's wrong. Can you imagine all these professors that taught there were no conspiracies, and now all you see on TV all day long is this conspiracy? But there are no conspiracies. What's all this about? You know, there are no conspiracies. And they're kind of put on the defensive, aren't they? And they're really in a bind. And we could sit back and say, I told you so. But what we want to do now is, yes, capitalize on it in any way we can. But you don't want to run off in the opposite direction and do it in a knee-jerk manner. Now, if I might give a commercial, not to the sponsoring organization, and with apologies to the God, Family, and Country rally here, I'd like to give a commercial for the organization that I am a member of the Central Council. I think that Mr. Robert Welch was right all along when he said what we have to do is educate the people. You know, Joseph de Maistre said, among many things, he said the people get exactly the type of government they deserve. I've been in Congress. A lot of people think if we can only get the power away from the president and back to Congress, we'd solve our problems. Wrong. They're just as bad. I tell you, if I have any problem with Congress, is that it reflects the American people too well. Now you might say, well, oh man, that's wrong to say that. You know what the problem is? The problem is that the American people are believing that they can get something for nothing when they get it from government, and they are charlatans who will capitalize on that belief. Conspirators and just plain charlatans will capitalize on that to get into office. And what we need is a massive educational effort to convince the American people that their problems are not in that one room, like the president said. That shocked me when the president said that, not because he said it. I knew he'd say something like that. But what shocked me is that there was no great reaction in the press. Well, that didn't really shock me either. I wouldn't have expected that from the press, I suppose. But by the way, without going on another tangent or another speech, I think Robert Welch was right when he said we ought to stay out of politics. But I won't go in and elaborate on that one. But the point I'm making here, for example, the John Birch Society has an excellent program coming up. That is a home educational program. It's modeled after a Mormon program, and I can't say anything bad about the Mormons after I analyzed my vote. Boy, that was a good common denominator there. I don't know. They might have thought with my 7 kids that I was one of them. I don't know. Maybe. But At any rate, this program is a home study program. I'm sure you can get information on it in the booth out here. I pointed out that what has happened in this country is that our educational system has adopted basically the same goals as the enemy. Now, how are you going to get out from under that? Poland's got out from under it. You know what they do in Poland? They haven't abolished the family there. They've hung tough on the family, and so when the kids come home from school, the parents say, okay, what'd they teach you, and let's undo it. Okay, and so they've been able to survive. They've been able to hang in there. And we've got to do something exactly like that, or pretty close to it. When the kids come home, you say, okay, the state law says you've got to go to that school, but it can't say we can't unteach what you've got there and unbrainwash you and teach you the traditions of this country when you're home here. And when I pointed out that and I'll tell you, that's why I wanted to give a plug for an organization that I happen to be on the council, because I think that is one of the solutions to the problem. That's one of the plans. First of all, there's many a good conservative family who in saving the country has lost their family, and you can't do that. And so you want to educate these kids at home, and you want to save them at home, and get that program, and we're building it. But, and I want to close up with this thought, one of the main things is where I started out here, is we've got to emphasize the basic problem. And it's a basic philosophic problem, and I hope it isn't, to use that word I used before, too ethereal and too big, because the implications come right down to everyday living, that we have got to emphasize, and we've got to emphasize in our whole fabric of life, this idea that there is a God, and there is a God's law, and the Ten Commandments were perfectly good enough for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years of our civilization. But we've gotten away, and you know, I hate to quote from psychiatrists. I think they're the most problem people right now, but psychiatrists will tell you when you've got problems, sometimes they have kids back crawling. They go back, okay, where did you go wrong? Where did we go wrong? We went wrong when we got rid of this idea that there is a God and there is a God's law. And so I'd like to quote from a little poem that I had to memorize when I was in high school. I wasn't psychoanalyzed when I was in high school when I did something wrong. It wasn't blamed on my environment or lack of federal funds. When I did something wrong, it was assumed that I had a free will and that I was therefore punished. And in our high school, the punishment was something that benefited us. They stood us in a corner and we had to memorize poetry. And one of the poems I had to memorize, you know, I still think in my youth one of the greatest advantages I had was that I had no liberal looking over my shoulder telling me how disadvantaged I was. But anyway... But at any rate, I stood in the corner and I had to memorize this poem. It was a poem written by a young man who thought, and perhaps was taught, undoubtedly was taught in his school, that he could do his own bag. At least that was the idea he developed, that he could do whatever he wanted. There was no God's law. There was no divine law to which he should, naughty word following, conform. You know, there's an old Spanish saying, the sword is the scepter by which an unruly people are governed. If you lose your ability to discipline yourself, which you can get only from recognizing an objective standard or a divine law, then you will be disciplined by the sword. If the scepter of the Lord is not adopted by individuals, which allows for self-discipline, then civilization requires that the secular government will come in with the sword, discipline from on high. But he was not taught this. His name was Francis Thompson. And he likened God's law to a hound. It dogged him. And the title of his poem was The Hound of Heaven, that followed after him no matter how he tried to get away from it. And he learned a lesson, and I'd just like to wind up with this by quoting from his poem. He said, I fled him, now referring to God and God's law. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. Up visted hopes I sped, and shot precipitated. Adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears I fled from those feet which followed after. With unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, they beat, and a voice beat, more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. Thank you. Are you going to take me off or shall I leave right now?
Thank you all.
Okay.